Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow with Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, first off, what does a ground war on Hamas look like?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. In essence, we know one thing: it's going to be messy. You've already seen two reported stories of Israel considering the beginning parts of their incursions. One potentially in the north by a tank, and the other one from basically the coast onwards. Whatever happens, though, it's not about even the ground. It's about what lies beneath the ground, the hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels. That is the part that's going to be messy. That is the part that's going to be hard. And should that stuff even be cleared, it's about going past things that are booby-trapped. It's about dismantling and destroying weapons that are in depots, all the while when you're under fire, and all the while when you're in an urban combat situation, which anyone who's looked at the nature of the U.S. war in Iraq, particularly in the western side of that theater, would tell you it is going to be messy.
Is there an end game here, or is it too early for that question?
I'm certainly not an Israeli domestic politics expert, but I think that too will dictate what kind of end game is acceptable when. The one thing that you do hear the most, though, is the destruction of Hamas. Whether that changes in the future, given domestic political sentiment in Israel to the defanging of Hamas, it's definitely too soon to tell.
Behnam, Israel is expanding its ground operation in the wake of U.S. airstrikes overnight against Iranian-backed militias in Syria. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't see the timing of the Israeli ground operations as tied to the U.S. kinetic strikes against Iran-backed militias in Syria. In particular, I think these are two theaters, and the Iranians are trying to divide out these theaters to distract America, to make sure the U.S. doesn't have adequate assets and personnel and time and attention and resources to stand with Israel in deed and not just in word. And that's precisely why you've seen 16 indirect fire attacks since October 17 to present, targeting facilities in Iraq and Syria. This is the first time after 16 strikes that the U.S. has responded. And just a few hours ago, militias, again in eastern Syria, fired 10 rockets. So clearly these militias were not deterred, nor were their patrons in Tehran.
And Behnam, could the fact that we did retaliate, could this escalate into a wider regional war?
Look, this is something that the Iranians are certainly dangling. You had Iran's foreign minister come to the United Nations just recently, I think the morning that the strikes were scheduled to happen. And he talked about a wider potential regional conflict, saying that anyone would be held accountable, basically pointing an indirect finger at Washington if Israel continued its offensive against the Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip. Iran is trying to save or bail out its chief proxy in Gaza by threatening this wider escalation. And so if Washington pulls punches and withdraws support for Israel, then Hamas might live to fight another day. And that's precisely what Iran is trying to achieve, to get political space to militarily save its proxy.
Well, I pose this question to Chris. I'll ask you as well. President Biden is signaling his hope for a new generation of peace talks after the war that would end in a two-state solution. How conceivable is that right now?
Again, I'll reiterate, I think that is going to be based a lot more on domestic politics among Palestinian factions, both in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as, of course, within Israel. But it is way too soon to put that cart before the horse. You cannot have an entity like Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And as you see now with Iran's constellation of partners and proxies called the Axis of Resistance, continue to put a knife and sharpen that knife against the neck of the Jewish state, and then at the same time call for peace talks when everyone else around them is calling for war. It would be a strategic mistake to take your eye off the ball this early, in my view.
Well said. Behnam, thank you so much for your insights. God bless.
Thank you. Likewise.